Aloha and welcome. Welcome to Think Tech, where we're raising public awareness about technology, energy, globalism, and diversification. As part of the Think Tech series, today's show is Global Connections, and I'm your host, Carlos Juarez. We're coming to you live from the Pioneer Plaza in the heart of downtown Honolulu. And joining me today is Lorraine Marais. We'll turn in just a moment to have a great conversation about some important issues. Lorraine, originally from South Africa, has been living now some time in Hawaii, and we're going to step back to reflect on her life of lots of interesting things. First, I want to just remind all of our viewers that we broadcast live on the internet at 2 and at 4 every weekday, and we also stream all of our shows on Ustream.tv or Spreaker.com. If you need links to any of these live streams or any previous broadcasts, just go to thinktechhawaii.com. And if you should like to join us here in our downtown studio for any of the shows, send an email to jay@thinktechhawaii.com. That's Jay at thinktechhawaii. So again, we're joined today by Lorraine. And Lorraine, thank you for coming today. I'm looking forward to a chance to just learn more about your own background, your interests, and a perspective as we're here today. Now, a week has passed since the passing of this great man, Nelson Mandela, in South Africa. And you yourself grew up there and are from South Africa. I'd like to maybe just ask you to give us a quick snapshot about yourself, your background.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me today. It's wonderful to be here. I feel very privileged to come and talk to you today about Nelson Mandela and the influence that he had on my life. Mm-hmm. A little bit about myself. I was born in South Africa. My ancestors been in South Africa nearly 400 years. Mm-hmm. So I'm truly African. I always joke with my students and say to them, if I become an American citizen, I will be African American. And then they always laugh about that. Mm-hmm. So I grew up in South Africa, went to school in the middle of South Africa. Mm-hmm. And then later on in my adult life, I was working in the Apartheid movement in the rural areas and community development. Mm-hmm. I'm trained as a social worker, mm-hmm. and I went to University of Stellenbosch in the Orange Free State, mm-hmm. and then I came here, and well, I came to America in 1990 mm-hmm. with the Kellogg Foundation, and then. Well, I ended here in Hawaii, and I'm now the director of the School of Social Work here.
Excellent.
So
now, I mean, you say as you were trained as a social worker, brought a lot of experience in working in South Africa, and today you're essentially an educator, an administrator that oversees a program in social work and helping train the next generation of social workers. But of course, we're wanting to draw on your experience. I mean, you grew up in a different place, in a different world. I mean, here in Hawaii, we often speak about our multiracial society. It's a very rich diversity of cultures, and of course, South Africa. Tell us a little bit more about the country, because of course we know it, of course, as the land of Nelson Mandela. We know it as this apartheid, but it's more complex than that. It's a fascinating mix of cultures as well. Yeah. So tell us a little.
Well, Desmond Tutu coined the phrase of saying that we are the rainbow nation of God, and that is truly that is really true, because it is a place where so many different cultures and languages. We have 13 official languages. Wow. So everybody knows a little bit of other languages. So. It is, of course, a country of beauty, absolutely beautiful landscapes. And I think the most important thing is the richness of the people. It's nearly now 20 years after apartheid. And it is remarkable to see how the country came together, of different walks of life, that people have built a new future for themselves and for their children. Yeah. So it is, I go back often. I was there last year during the summer. I still have family there. I work also still there in organizational development with NGOs. So South Africa is a very unique place. I think in general, South Africans are people from the earth, I would say.
Connected to the land
Yeah,
in some
connected
way.
to the land. I grew up although in a white traditional home, it was very connected to the earth. You know, I grew up with sangomas and traditional healers. My parents didn't believe very much in the white doctors, so they always went to the sangomas. So I grew up with, if you're from Africa, you always have one foot in this world and one foot in the other world, because the ancestors are always around you. You know, so you, this is just how you are, you know, and there is this interconnectedness between people. It doesn't matter from which cultural group you are or tribal group you are interrelated.
Excellent.
You know.
Well, it's a fascinating story, and I think we often speak of Hawaii as this place of a gathering of people, and yet grounded in the indigenous culture. If you live here, if you come to understand this place, you need to know something about that story. And similarly, I would guess in South Africa, while you have cultures, whether it's British or Dutch or French or many of the Indian from South Asia, ultimately they too have to connect to the indigenous cultures that were there, let's say, earlier. And so fascinating. Well, we'll certainly tease out some of the issues, I mean, of how that country, the world of South Africa, has really evolved over the years. You were there at a certain time, you came away, and now you continue to go back. I know you've also had opportunities to take others there, and tell me briefly about that. You've had some student groups that you've been able to take to South Africa?
Yeah, I took about 26, 28 students over the years to South Africa, and they came away always with a life transforming experience. You know, they said, of course, first of all, because there is such a great disparity between the rich and the poor there, so they are usually overwhelmed by that disparity, because it is not far remote from each other. You see this huge mansion, and then next to it you see a shack. You know, so it is very much in your face kind of situation. And many of the students, that was the first encounter for them to have experience with that kind of poverty. You know, but they also saw the strength and the resilience of people, and that really amazed them and inspired them to come back and do some of that here back at home, you know. And that was so wonderful, because that is my goal. I want them to experience another culture different from their own, but with it to inspire them to come and show leadership here and try to change the world for the better.
And these experiences, I mean, we often think of the big picture of the world, but ultimately it means happening in local communities, and so you meet real people that are solving issues, making a difference right in their own immediate backyard, right? And that's what can help. People who have that experience can come back and realize, well, you may not change the whole world, but if you can change some piece of it, you're doing that, right? Very fascinating. And tell me a little bit about your early years, because I mean, you grew up and then you began working as a social worker in South Africa itself. Did you have work experience there in urban areas, rural settings? What was the nature of your work?
Like I said, in the 70s, I started to work in the rural areas of South Africa as a social worker / community development worker, you know. But our community development is a little different than you have it here. It is not really only infrastructure development and the resources, but it is really empowering, provide opportunities for people to empower themselves so that they can create a better future for themselves, you know. And so I was mostly in the northeast of the Cape Province. I worked for many, many years. Like I said, I grew up in the middle of South Africa, very kind of traditional childhood, although my parents, they didn't even graduate from high school. But my father was always the one who emphasized education. For him, that was very important, and that was my saving grace, you know. So I didn't go to privileged schools. My parents were actually quite poor. And that is also a myth that all white South Africans are rich. It's also not true. You know, just like America, everybody here must be rich, you know. So when I grew up, like I said, very much traditional home. My parents, politically, they were also not open to they were not progressive thinkers around these things. I don't know, from an early age, when I can remember, I knew that this this policy of apartheid, or this law of apartheid, was wrong. I don't know how, but I knew that there was something wrong here. This is not right. And it is, as things progress through the years, I realized that things need to change. And I was a very practicing Christian at that time, and for me it was important that peace and justice cannot go together unless you can never have peace without justice. And that is why I joined the anti-apartheid movement early in my adulthood. And life took its own course after that. So.
Quite fascinating. You've lived through this history and seen the country itself now transform itself. You described how, I guess it was Desmond Tutu described it as this rainbow nation, and we often see that reference. And of course, as we'll see, the legacy of someone like Nelson Mandela. Well, today we obviously commemorate his strength of character, his spirit, and yet at the same time we hear again and again a lot of need to, he was not a god, he was not a saint. He, like all of us, was a human, but what he had clearly was an ability to, in some ways, transcend some of that and to foster a process of reconciliation. Perhaps I've heard it put very well that his long experience in prison helped him to really rethink, and as he came out, he realized that probably he could do more by being more, how should I say, in some ways, conciliatory or embracing his enemies. Because obviously one strategy would have been to just revolt and pursue a more aggressive approach. He, in fact, kind of stood up to that, and rather, interesting. I'll be curious to hear your reflections on, what are the lessons that we draw, especially as someone who continues working in the field of social work, where we try to foster things like that, reconciliation and solving, peacefully issues. Clearly, in his story, it's one where the world he grew up in, which was very harsh and very unjust, he did take a route that was to seek, in the early days of violence and an armed struggle, which I guess at some point he and his fellow, travelers, if you will, decided that they couldn't work within the system, but that cost them, quite a bit. They were put in prison. Do you have a sense, maybe from the early days, how his struggle got transformed? And what would you say about the way in which he, in his life, somehow came full circle to suddenly find himself working with and becoming the first elected president, a very important transition?
I think one of the things that's outstanding for me about Nelson Mandela was that he worked for something greater than himself. It was not because of himself, it was not his ego, but it was about something that's greater than himself. And that is why he could come out of jail, out of prison, with, it's not about me. It's about what we want to accomplish together. And I think that he embodies for me that goal of changing the course of a nation. And it's not because I am that important, but I'm just part of the team. And you hear him on many occasions, he would speak and say, I'm just part of the team. The ANC allow me to be the president. It's not because I'm that great, but they allow me to take this position, which I think in that, coming from a collective culture, we always have to remember that Africa is a collective culture. It's not about me, it's about all of us. If you look at the principles of Ubuntu, which is, I am because of you. And so that is so ingrained in who we are, and that is during the time that Mandela was in prison, for example, the movement, just everywhere people stood up. If you think about 1976, with what happened in Soweto with the youth there, that they said, we will not go back to school until we're free.
So this was
they say liberation before education was the slogan. you know.
And this refers to a time when there was a revolt against school children.
The uprising. The uprising started, and it never calmed down again. You know, if you think about the turn of the century, 19th century, where we were twice a British colony and a Dutch colony, and when the British came, they started with apartheid. Slowly but surely taking people off the voting, the black Africans, taking them off the voting registration. And then eventually in 1948, when the Afrikaners came into power, they just made it a law, separation. Segregation. And they took it further. And if you think about the 60s, where Nelson Mandela, the Rivonia trial, where, because the ANC in the beginning said, we will do it with nonviolence. And then when they saw, but the regime is not going to listen to nonviolence, that is when Umkhonto weSizwe, the Spear of the Nation, was formed in 1961. And Mandela was first to start organizing that. And the government realized, well, here is trouble, you know, and that is why they started with this whole process against him. And the Rivonia trial, I mean, there were 7 others. And of course, he was accused number 1. And then went to prison, you know. But there was a lot of people in the movement. I mean, many of our friends actually died also in the years of we were struggling against apartheid. You know.
Well, no, it's a very important story to understand and for us to continue to you know, reflect about. I think among the fascinating things was how that experience, that long experience he had in prison, was one where his coming out of that experience, he was able to ensure, on a very curious way, paradoxically, the destruction of the system, but without the need for widespread violence. There was a lot of fear and concern, and even during the time he was in prison, that you know that this was going to lead to that. But quite remarkably, we saw a transition, and you know, this is a story I want to continue. But right now, I'd like us to take just a short break, and we'll come right back to resume the conversation. So stay tuned with us. We're joined here by Lorraine Marais, who's from South Africa and been living now many years in the U.S. But she'll continue sharing some of her reflections as we think back in this moment of reflection with the recent passing of Nelson Mandela. Join us in a minute. Thank you.
We want to thank our underwriters.
Hawaiian Electric Company and its affiliates Maui Electric on Maui and Hawaii Electric Light Company on Hawaii Island are deeply committed to the communities they serve.
Galen Ho is a senior executive of BAE Systems, a global defense, security, and aerospace company.
The High Tech Development Corporation, the state's leading technology agency, attached to the Department of Business, Economic Development, and Tourism.
Castle and Cooke, Hawaii, with a time-honored legacy that spans more than 160 years and revolves around its mission of investing in Hawaii, creating communities, and providing for the needs of our state.
Hawaii Gas, formerly the Gas Company, a proponent of the Liquefied Natural Gas Initiative, helping Hawaii achieve its transition to clean energy and a better energy future.
Collateral Analytics, a Hawaii-based tech company empowering the real estate industry with greater and faster access to the tools and data they need to make better informed property investment decisions.
I'm Nicole Hori. Thanks so much for joining us on Think Tech.
I'm Maria Kashem. See you next time.
And aloha, welcome. We're back, we're live, and we're Think Tech. This is the Global Connection Show. I'm your host, Carlos Juarez, and I'm joined today by Lorraine Marais. And Lorraine, from South Africa, you've been now living in the U.S. many years, as we were discussing. And of course, we're reflecting at this moment because here in the past week, we've seen a tremendous sort of watershed period. The passing of Nelson Mandela, a historic figure, as he's known in his tribal word, Madiba. And of course, the first president democratically elected of South Africa. He would come to rise to power and more than that, have a lasting legacy. And I think it's fascinating. A couple of quick factoids. He did come to office in 1994, not long after being released, and he would retire only one term later in 1999 after serving a term. And in many ways, by doing so, it's a remarkable feature for this man because he once said that great leaders gain authority by giving it away. And I wonder if we might reflect a little more. You described, one of his often said things is that, he's not alone, or it's not just him, or it's about a bigger thing. And it is so true, and especially as you're describing maybe either the values or the culture in South Africa, that people have to see that they're part of this bigger thing, or more than him.
Yeah.
Talk to us a little bit more about that, or in what ways is that sort of value reflected in maybe South African culture, or maybe African culture more broadly, the sense of either community or belonging to the people, to the country, or what have you?
Yeah, well, we often hear this phrase of it takes a village. And the principles of Ubuntu is very strong in South Africa, because like you say, it's about community. You are never alone because you are always with people. So, and you see yourself always connected to other people too. Just for a minute to come back to what you earlier said about Mandela, who was this figure of reconciliation and forgiveness. I mean, because before he came out, everybody was released from prison. Everybody thought that South Africa is going to end in a bloodbath. There was going to be a civil war. There's no way that we can survive these years of oppression without that. And when he came out and he was reaching across the aisle, and he was reaching across to people who have oppressed him, brutally oppressed Black Africans, it was just incredible. Because I think the fact that he had the ability to forgive. He said one time, I heard the speech of him that say, it's easier to be angry, it's easier to hate, but it's much more difficult to forgive. You have to have courage in your heart to forgive people who did wrong to you.
No, absolutely.
And I mean, he was that embodiment, I think, and that was the message. He was the moral compass of South Africa. He kept, doesn't matter who you were, but he was always there in the background, a man of compassion, but don't see compassion for weakness. He could very much stand up for what was right. And he said he was even willing to give his life so that nobody will be oppressed in this beautiful land of us. Those are some of the words that he used before.
No, very powerful. And of course, we might naturally assume, he follows, and in many ways, many of the early struggles were looking at the experience of Mahatma Gandhi, who himself had experience in South Africa in his early days, and of course the civil rights movement here in the U.S., the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. And maybe from your perspective, or knowing Mandela and his experience, I mean, in what ways did he either embody or reflect or draw from those other great figures, Gandhi or Martin Luther King Jr.?
I definitely think so. I mean, because it was more or less that same time period that they were around anyway, But I think it is also hardship, the fact that he was in jail for so many years. That really gives you a long time to think about. What is it? Why am I here? And what is it that I'm here to do? And I think the fact that he went also with a lot of his comrades, and there was this underground messages sent and learning, because they created a university within the prison, so that they could develop themselves and grow as people too. So I think in that sense, he really embodies that fact that if you can turn your hardship around into compassion, forgiveness, then you can bring people together, and you can do a lot of good things.
And I can imagine from the vantage point of white South Africans, on one hand, before all this came out, a lot of fear and uncertainty, and even immigration of many people, and yet I guess what I'm getting at is once it came to pass that in fact he came out, and his first gestures and his whole persona was one of seeking forgiveness, understanding that, look, these white South Africans, they are Africans. They're they have to be part of the the future of this country. It must have come as I don't know, either a shock or a surprise or somehow confusion in the part of many white South Africans who might have expected the worst.
Yeah, yeah. With his attitude, I mean, he won the hearts and the minds of many white people who were for apartheid. That's it. When you go back to South Africa these days, there's nobody but that was ever for apartheid. It's really interesting. Sure. 20 years. I mean, people have changed, totally changed. We have now a generation of children who don't know apartheid anymore. You have
to read about it in a history book, or well, it's and I know, and again, we've seen so much attention in the recent days. I recall a interview with one of the former prisoners prison guards who saw him, and how he came to admire and respect him, and also even a quote F.W. de Klerk, who obviously was the leader of the apartheid system that would eventually release him. But you have these people who were his former oppressors or prisoners who are also admiring this man for his courage, his character, and of course I understand too that while he was in prison those 27 years, he was consistently refusing to compromise. They were giving him options to come out early or be released, and in order to obtain his freedom, he stood his ground and wanted to insist that no, until the system is going to be somehow changed. So that's a remarkable feature. He remained unbowed even under that harsh treatment, and determined to help bring reconciliation. So quite a story indeed. I wonder, again, maybe if we continue this a little further, I mean, what type of lessons, I mean, you've spoken to some of it, forgiveness, or I mean, what are some of the challenges that many people face? It doesn't have to be in an apartheid system, even in, whether it's in the U.S. or in our state here, other places, there are people living in conditions of difficulty, there's tension, we may have a democratic system, but we still have problems that have to be solved. And what would you describe as some of the either lessons or insights that his experience gives us to somehow let people see, look, even in the worst of situations, there are things you can do, that you can rise above it. Maybe the idea of thinking beyond just yourself, or I don't know, any reflections on lessons we can draw from his life experience for other places?
Yeah, I think that the courage of forgiveness is a very strong one. Like I said, it is so much easier to be angry at people who do wrong to you, but it is much harder to forgive and to show that forgiveness also. The other thing is also the openness to dialogue, that you will bring people together to sit around the table and talk to each other and be real about it. Not with all these political hidden agendas or, all these maneuvers that people have around politics and stuff, but just be genuine and be straightforward. And that's one thing of Africans. Kind of we say things the way it is, I mean, and that opens up that opportunity for other people then also to be real and genuine. I think, because otherwise we really don't move forward. And you have to be able to also embrace conflict. You cannot flee from conflict. You have to deal with it. And the sooner we learn that, because by dealing with conflict, you can actually come to a much greater place than before.
Either if you're avoiding it or not coming to the issue.
Because it creates more conflict the more you avoid it. But if you deal with it in a compassionate way, realizing that we are all human, we have all our mistakes, we are basically the same people. We are the same. We want the same things in life, and come with compassion to each other, but doesn't give up. I mean, social justice is a very important part of my life, that you will stand for what's right, and you have to stand up for what you believe in. You cannot just go with the wind, depending on what direction the wind blows. You have to take a stand.
Yeah, no, that's a fair point. And I'm also puzzled because on one hand, Mandela and his story, I mean, he early on took the path of, hey, we've got to take up arms because it won't work. And yet he also came to realize at some point, maybe it was after the long reflection in his prison time, but what I'm also intrigued is that here's somebody who ended up, some of what you touched on already is that, the dialogue, but also just getting to know your enemy in some way.
Yeah.
And there's often a description about how he came to try to understand, well, how do these people think? What makes them see the world that way? And tell us a little bit about that. I mean,
what is interesting is he also learned Afrikaans, but that is my language, and because the regime was Afrikaners, and so he said that if you really want to understand somebody, you have to learn their language. So he could speak Afrikaans, and it was interesting when he became president. The first thing that he did is he invited the leaders of the previous government, their wives, to his house and had the tea party for them. So everybody was like, "What are you doing?" Here and there was a lot of pictures taken of that occasion, and then they were sitting and laughing with him, and all with hats and like a traditional tea party, and it was so interesting, and you could see that personal relationship, how that grows, and that is the key. You have to get to know people, and you have to open up to them, ask who they are, how's their family doing, and hear more about what makes this tick.
That's right.
And the fact that he knew the Afrikaner struggle also, because Afrikaners were oppressed by the British.
And kind of pushed into into
and if you read the ANC documents and you compare it to the documents of the Afrikaner movement, the same language. If you take the names away, it's the same language. And that was the expectation, that Afrikaners would understand the struggles of black South Africans. And they didn't. And that was, for me as an Afrikaner, very, I was very sad to see that my people couldn't understand, and they were just looking out for themselves.
Oh, well, this is fascinating. Well, we'll take another short break right here, and as we come back, we're going to continue this great conversation we're having with Lorraine Marais. I'm Carlos Juarez. This is our Global Connection show, part of the Think Tech series, and we'll be back in just a minute, so stay tuned for more on the story.
Aloha, I'm Nicole Hori for Think Tech. For nearly half a century, the Hawaii Foreign Trade Zone No. 9 has brought the benefits of the Foreign Trade Zone program to Hawaii businesses and entrepreneurs. DBET, the Department of Business, Economic Development and Tourism, operates Hawaii's Foreign Trade Zone program to encourage international business and economic development. The Foreign Trade Zone's mission is to increase the amount of international trading activity in Hawaii, thereby providing employment opportunities for the residents of our island state. For more information, see ftz9.org. I'm Nicole Hori. Mahalo.
Hello, welcome, and we're back, and this is Think Tech's Global Connections show. I'm Carlos Juarez, your host, and joined today by Lorraine Marais. We're having a great conversation about South Africa, a country she's grown up in, and of course it's gone through some tremendous transitions. The recent passing of Nelson Mandela, who of course an important figure in helping that country transition from the Apartheid system to become really, in some respects, a leading voice and example in Africa, one of the first sort of democratic transitions. I want to get back, we were just having a great conversation really about one of the things that he did so effectively, which is really relevant for not just this experience, but anywhere, needing to understand if you're either your enemy, your adversary, and of course in the case of Mandela, it was getting to learn the language so that he could understand more about maybe the values and the belief systems. And as it turns out, I mean, as he would come to learn, the Afrikaner story was one that had its own period of either hardship or discrimination or what have you. I've done some study on the history of South Africa, but to what extent can you add to us a quick snapshot of, Afrikaners, of course, descendants of Dutch who had settled in Southern Africa, but then as the British came in, there was a pretty big struggle there that would effectively, cause a lot of hardship for them, and this in turn shaping their, views. Can you share a little bit of insights into the story or maybe some of the history of Afrikaner South Africa?
Well, my grandmother, for example, she was in the concentration camps in the Anglo-Boer War from 1899 to 1902.
Yeah.
And so that was a period of where Afrikaners were very much oppressed also by the British, you know. But not only at that time, later on it became more in every sphere of life. I mean, especially in the government, for example. They were kind of ostracized and prevented from taking on key positions. And what they did is they infiltrated, you know, the general social, around social issues, if you will. They became the principals in schools, and that is the way that they infiltrated the system. So to erode it from the inside, that was the belief. And so in 1948, they organized in such a way that they could come to power, you know. But unfortunately, they didn't learn the lesson. They said, well, now we're on top and we're going to stay on top. And we will not allow anybody to share this with us, you know. And that is the sad story. I mean, because they took apartheid that the British started with, and they've just perfected it. That's what we said. Because in the 50s and 60s, I mean, there was just horrendous legislation that was passed to totally cut Black Africans out of everything, land, marriage, voting rights, everything. You know, they couldn't have property, they had to live in certain areas, they couldn't move wherever they wanted to. I mean, we have, you know, about the passbooks that they had to carry, and that was part of the uprisings, and especially in the 70s. When these Soweto uprisings started, the young people said, we will not, because they were trying to force Afrikaans as the language in all the schools. And they said, no, we won't. You know, and that started, that also triggered, of course, already a situation that was not good, you know.
Well, no, it's a very tough story. And yet, as I want to go back to this idea, I mean, we spoke briefly about how one of Mandela's lessons was that, how did you describe it, that if you want to get to know was it your enemy or something, that you have to, you know, learn their lange or something like this.
You have to learn their language and their belief system and talk to them. You cannot say, bring about change if you're not willing to go into dialogue. And talk to people, you know. No,
and I think what I'm trying to get at here is that this is so critical as a lesson and maybe just a reality in dealing with across cultures. That if you want to break through barriers, if you want people to see that you respect and understand them, you've got to learn some of their language. And language, I often tell even my own students, it's not just how you might say a few phrases or order something from a menu, but it helps you understand how people think, how they see the world, what they value, what forms their belief systems. And by doing so, you also gain a certain greater level of respect. If you're talking in their language, you're showing some sign of respect, and that can help break down some of these otherwise barriers that might exist. So it goes both ways.
Absolutely.
Maybe I wonder again, I'd like to kind of push this as we've been doing, you know, what lessons do we take away? Because again, you know, he's passed now, but he leaves behind a legacy. On one hand, you know, the story in South Africa, and of course there it remains a very real challenge, and today, 20 years, you know, since that transition, it's still a country with deep, you know, social challenges and issues. Even as we speak today, the current president is under tremendous criticism and pressure. He is not, of course, a figure maybe as revered as someone like Mandela would, but nevertheless, you know, people will still harken back to, you know, what can we draw from in the form of inspiration? As you think of maybe South Africa today, I mean, what do you see as some of the continual challenges? Or, you know, it's made a lot of progress, but it still remains a long way to go. Any thoughts on, you know, what do you see as the biggest challenges it will continue to face?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is definitely still the disparity between the rich and the poor, because South Africa is now currently probably number 1 or number 2 in the most unequal society in the world. And that need to change, because when Mandela became president, the expectation was across the country, our situation is going to change now.
Yeah.
And it's 20 years later, and yes, there's been a lot of changes, but still the majority of people are in extreme poverty. And I think that is one of the largest problems that South Africa have. And that cannot continue without some kind of out for different sides, you know. So I think that is one of the biggest things.
And it is, as I think you've expressed it well, it is truly a place of paradox. You have tremendous wealth in terms of natural resources, even human capital, and just today, particularly relevant to or relative to the days of apartheid, when it was a rather ostracized and closed system. I mean, today it's a global player. It's got connections to the world in a way, and yet that paradox is that standing right next to that prosperity and wealth is extreme poverty and injustice, and so land that's rich but at the same time poor. And I guess you would hope that the system is going to help to address that, but it's never easy, and the challenges remain. I think the other interesting thing is that to the extent that it is a more democratic society, that's on one hand it's a plus, but on another hand it also reveals some of the weaknesses, or I often say it might expose more of the corruption or even like the new leadership that's in place now. As often happens, people get in power and then they're maybe more interested in their own survivability rather than the bigger picture.
Yeah, there's a lot of self-interest, unfortunately, at the new leadership that was created after apartheid was over. So, and that is the thing, the so-called gravy train. People are in this for themselves and not thinking of the community anymore. So that is what make the masses really very unhappy. And I think that's one of the reasons why they were not so friendly towards President Zuma when he came to be talking, because people are suffering in the townships and everywhere, and they see the corruption and the fraud that's happening, and there's not enough measures in place to prevent that from happening.
No, it's something you see happen in a lot of sort of, let's say, newer democracies, countries that are in transition. There's always excitement, but then the honeymoon ends. The expectations are often too unrealistic, that everybody was going to be somehow reaching prosperity in 5 years, and no, it remains a challenge. And yet, again, I think with the case of this story, it will always be part of the history and lore and context of South Africa, that people can hopefully draw on that experience to say, well, wait a minute, we can do better, we can reach across. I guess it's ultimately you need leaders that can somehow mobilize that, right? And that doesn't come easy. As I've thought myself about this great man who's just left us, and of course it's not a big surprise, we've been waiting for some time, he's been quite ill, but nevertheless my point is that you don't have leaders of this magnitude come along too often, and as I was thinking, it's like, gosh, will we see another person in our lifetime that had this type of transformational, impact? Hard to say, because I mean, he does stand out as a larger-than-life figure and garnered a lot of awards and recognition, no doubt. And maybe as we kind of wind down our conversation, I mean, you think of as a South African yourself, and you've seen the country go through such a tumultuous past and exciting transition, but still challenges ahead. I mean, when you saw a lot of the attention this past week on it, I mean, did you feel what kind of emotions? A sense of pride, a sense of sadness, a sense of just everything mixed together? Yeah,
it's probably a little bit of both of that, but there was also a sense of me that what he was standing for is in me. So I feel very connected to his ideals and his dreams and his values, because that is kind of a reflection also of what I believe. So it is as if he's gone now, but his legacy will remain. Like we say in Sesotho, we say "Hamba kahle tata," which means "walk well, father." And so I want to say, walk well, father, because he was really the father of the nation. So, and he will remain that, because we believe in Africa that he's still with us. you know, that he's just joining the ancestors now and forming the circle around us.
That's right, and I think as we speak now, they're returning his remains to his home birthplace and part of the Cape region, and so bringing full circle his life. But as you've put very well there, hopefully a legacy that we will continue to speak about and teach about and draw inspiration from.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and I think you put it well in that, you know, his struggle really is everybody's struggle. It's not like it was his individual. He simply embodied it, and he was able to articulate it in a way.
I hope that for the young people, that the parents and all the institutions will keep his spirit alive, so that the young people can learn from that, because we have a generation that really don't know him, because he disappeared from the public scene for quite a while now, and so they don't really know too much about him, you know. So I hope that in South Africa people will keep his legacy alive, especially with the young people.
Absolutely.
Because there's a lot of trouble, young people, there's lots of violence and crime, you know. But I always had hope.
Yeah.
You know, that there's very strong leaders and an inspiring country.
Well, no, very well put, and I think, you know, yourself as a continued educator helping to train our next generation of social workers, we will continue to draw on that. I mean, I share that same passion that, you know, we can't forget the history. We have to, you know, constantly revisit it, remind people that, you know, while you may not have grown up with him, just as a young child, I remember stories of Martin Luther King Jr., even reading about Gandhi later, that can't help but inspire you, because these are people who were larger than life, and not just themselves. It was about a bigger cause, and
absolutely.
That's what's critical for us to share. Well, we've come to the end of our show. I want to just thank you so much for this great conversation, and perhaps an opportunity for us to continue in other areas in the future. We have to we have to wrap it up now as we've come out of time. I'm Carlos Juarez, and this has been Global Connections, part of our Think Tech Hawaii series. We've been talking with Lorraine Marais, who's got a lot of experience having grown up in South Africa, worked in social work for many years, and today is an educator and administrator as director of the social work program at Hawaii Pacific University. And she's had the opportunity to take some students down to South Africa, transformational, life-changing experiences, of course. But the show must end, and yet the conversation will continue. I want to thank all of you for being here, and of course, thanks to many who've made this show possible. Our production manager, Ian Montana. We have our communication director, Chrissy Goffeden, and of course, Jay Fidel, who helps bring all of this together somehow. And I want to thank you, our listeners, for joining us today. Think Tech will be back next week with our regular shows and many others in the series here. So please stay tuned until then. If you want to get any of the emails or daily updates, program advisories, go to thinktechhawaii.com and they'll put you on an email list. Thank you so much. And remember, we broadcast every day at 2 and at 4, so different shows that might interest you. If you want to friend us on Facebook or otherwise, again, go there and you can find us as well. So, of course, we'll see you next week for the next episode of Global Connections. Aloha, everyone.